Absurdistanis, and welcome to Absurdistan, the transatlantic political podcast with news and opinion from the absurd political reality which is our home. My name is John.
And my name is Adam.
This week is the second installment of our summer series on democracy. In today's episode, we examine voting, particularly issues regarding voter participation and biases.
Yeah, that's right. What do you do when in a democracy where, obviously democracy is rule of the people don't want to rule? Many Western democracies are seeing low participation, low voter turnout, low political activism. So is this a problem for one? And what solutions should be implemented to help fix this, if it is indeed a problem?
I definitely think it's a problem. We see that in the United States where, you used to have 80% people coming out to vote for presidential elections, and that's been whittled all the way down to about 50% on
55,
average. So
55 in the last one.
55 in the last one. There was some in the mid-2000s where, the mid-early 2000s where you got up to like 58. But, in 96, I think it was 49%. It was very low. So, yeah, you're seeing definitely a decrease in voter participation in those larger federal elections. But even so, even more so for the midterm elections for Congress, you're seeing it hover between like 30 and 40%. The turnouts for midterm elections, and particularly for Congress, are very, very low.
What do you think is the cause of low voter participation?
Honestly, just kind of in relation to our representation episode, I think that it kind of is birthed out of a feeling of not feeling represented, not feeling like your vote counts. I honestly do. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I honestly do think that there's the perceived delusion of your vote and how much your vote matters in the United States and probably around the world as well. But as governments get larger and nations get larger, and in the United States we have 320 million people, so the slice of the pie that you're contributing to the government is so infinitesimally small that it doesn't seem to matter.
But you do have the problem globally in which, even in Ireland, randomly, but the UK, Ireland, other places, not just the United States, you are seeing kind of a dip in voter participation. So it's not just limited to the US. It seems to be kind of Western world wide. I'm not as familiar with the voting turnout populations in a place like India, for instance, but certainly there's been a decline over the past 20 years in voter participation in the West.
Do you think that it might be because people are becoming disillusioned with the representative government and think that it doesn't matter either way?
I'm not sure if it's specifically that or the feeling that they're... And maybe this is the root of Brexit, actually, and the root of Trump, is the feeling that globalization has led to a world in which not only is your voice insignificant relative to the country, but your voice is insignificant relative to, global economics. And so you know that your government is going to be participating in a worldwide economy for its own benefit or for the benefit of its own interests. Again, as we said in our representation episode, generally governments have a duty to the people that have financed them during their campaigns. And so I wonder if there's a certain disillusionment or even a deep cynicism that's beginning to settle in.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of at the root of the populist movements that we're seeing, because we're not seeing people hesitant to come out and vote for populist movements.
Yeah.
It's definitely a grassroots movement that is being galvanized by these movements. Like you saw with Bernie Sanders, typical groups of American public that don't come out and vote all that much, which is unfortunately my generation, millennials and even younger than millennials, younger voters, that you don't normally see a whole lot of political engagement out of. You saw a incredible amount of mobilization on those voters, particularly in the Democratic primaries with Bernie Sanders. But you didn't see those sorts of numbers come out to support Hillary Clinton, is kind of what I'm saying. I think that the perception that the elite run everything now, and that the average concerns of the Joe the plumber, to use Obama's phrase, the average concerns of Joe the plumber and the union guy down the street are not being represented. And so I think a lot of this comes from not so much apathy, but a feeling of helplessness.
Ooh, okay. Which I guess you could say is true also in the Brexit case, Europe being this, or the EU being this kind of far-off government that had a perceptibly large impact on your life and you not being able to hold them to account. I guess that would make sense. And you're right, actually, in terms of kind of support for populist movements, you've got, Trump was effectively a populist. Brexit was a populist movement. You've got now a populist government in Italy. You have populist right-wingers doing very well in places like the Netherlands and France.
That's right.
It's no surprise then that when a party comes out to defend the people, quote unquote, against the large, powers that be, that they would begin to do well. Maybe the two are intertwined. Maybe democratic participation is going down simply because there's a kind of a feeling of helplessness. But there's other problems as well with voting. For instance, there's like massive cognitive biases that go into voting. We're not very good at being rational individuals when we go out to vote.
No.
And so when you get to an election, and this would be us included unless we're very keyed into it, we have an array of biases. We have, the confirmation bias. We tend to only listen to information that supports our pre-existing views. We have the availability bias, which means that evidence of, particular things happening mean that we tend to accept that they happen often. So terrorism, for instance, is a good example of this. The fact that we can remember incidents of terrorism make us feel as if they happen often when they actually don't. You've got the effective contagion, you could call it, which effectively means that our emotions cloud our judgment. We're not very good at separating our anger at something from our kind of voting behavior.
Right.
We have no idea how to get around framing effects. So the way that something is presented to us just affects the way that we feel about something. And we don't acknowledge those either when we go into the voting. But so we're just not good voters, even when we show up to vote.
The framing thing, I think, is very important. But I also think that that's related to what you were talking about with the availability bias, because something like terrorism, for instance, the media definitely certainly plays a role in this too. That the problem is there's so many biases in the fourth estate that people don't really know anything about the issues, and the things that they do know about the issues are vastly overstated. So if somebody is super concerned about crime from illegal immigrants, for instance, that's actually fairly well studied, and actually it turns out there's a much lower crime rate amongst illegal immigrants than there are actually among natural-born citizens anyway. So or for terrorism, for instance, where there's this massive fear over terrorism, and we forfeit all these rights. Like, we no longer have Fourth Amendment rights in the United States because we have the NSA, which is basically allowed to spy on us whenever they want. We give up the ease of which we used to be able to travel through the air with the TSA, which is really security theater. It doesn't actually stop any attacks. It just makes us feel safer. And so we allow all these intrusions on our life for something that is so minimal of a threat, especially to the mainland United States. But we don't pay attention to things that are much larger issues that, for some reason or another, are framed in such a way that we don't view them as such large issues.
Like, we tend to frame issues in a certain way as well. So if I'm sitting on the center right, I'm going to be framing, the recent Donald Trump, separating families at the border issue. I'm going to frame that in a particular way that someone on the right isn't. In fact, someone on the right is going to be, in fact, I saw this on Facebook, they begin to rationalize and justify the actions of the Trump administration. The problem is that I already have in my cognitively biased mind that this is just a ridiculous, evil separation of the parent and the child, which, in actual fact, probably isn't true. But my emotion about the case, my preconceived expectation of what Donald Trump is going to do relative to his both general demeanor and policy history have affected the way that I perceive that particular problem. And it's true of the people on the right as well.
One of the problems, I think, is that the human mind is so good at rationalizing. So
yes, it is.
We tend to...
We're very good at justifying ourselves.
Right, we're justifying ourselves. And it's really interesting, actually, if you look at things that are coming out of evolutionary psychology, for instance, where you have a propensity for people to be tribal and to want to be part of a group. And what ends up happening is that people forego... essentially, what the argument is that evolutionarily, being right isn't as important as being in a socially cohesive group. So we deprioritize facts that actually confront the narrative of the group that we're in, and prioritize our feelings and what we want to be true. For instance, they've taken brain scans of people who have had facts that contradict their position and what they believe presented to them, and it triggers the same portions of the brain as though they're being physically attacked. Essentially, if the goal is to be an informed voter, our brains are sort of malformed for that purpose.
To quote other brain studies, they've taken scans of people who have been viewing videos of people from the other party being called out, and there's a significant kind of pleasure center lighting up in the brain as well. So like we're just not, you're right, we're just not...
Schadenfreude, yeah.
Exactly, we're not cognitively competent.
Developed enough to...
Well, right, yeah, developed enough to be able to participate in a way that allows us to overlook or overcome all of our biases. But we also have a problem of knowledge. This is another thing. So it's not just the fact that, you know, we are biased when we come to the voting booth. It's just that we generally don't know what the heck is going on. There's a list of a few things. I'll read off a couple of them. This is from a book called Against Democracy, so you can kind of guess.
Oh, I was going to bring this up later.
The slant of this book. This is by a guy named Brennan.
Jason Brennan.
That's right. He's compiled just a few things here that over the past American voters haven't known. And, you know, this is a specifically American list, but this is certainly going to be true for British voters, I know. So during election years, most citizens cannot identify any congressional candidates in their district.
I believe it.
Citizens generally don't know which party controls Congress.
I believe that too.
I wonder if that's true now or if it's kind of getting into the... No, I would think that there's enough apathetic people out there not to know.
Oh, maybe. I mean, it's so highly publicized now, though.
The 2010 midterm presidential election, only 34% of voters knew what the Troubled Asset Relief Program was. That's TARP.
Yeah.
And only that 34% knew that it was actually enacted under George W. Bush and not under Barack Obama.
There was this, I think it was like a right-wing YouTuber who went out onto the streets and was interviewing random people and asking them about bills that were in Congress and if they supported them or not. And he was just making things up. And the people were like, oh, yeah, I support that. I think that's a great idea. And then he asked them to justify it. And they would make up a whole story as to why they believed it based on the name of the act that he gave them. So it would be like the act was, you know, the End Childhood Detentions Act or whatever. And they'd be like, oh, we think that's important for whatever reasons. And he's like, well, that bill actually doesn't say that. And they'd be like, oh, I thought it did. But it's a completely made up bill. And so in surveys that have been done, more than half of people think they're smarter than the average person.
Yes, that's right.
So not only do we not know a whole lot, we think we know more than we do.
Just to add a couple more things from my list, Americans vastly overestimate how much money is spent on foreign aid, and so many of them mistakenly believe we can significantly reduce the budget deficit by cutting foreign aid. This isn't true. 73% of Americans do not understand what the Cold War is about.
Not to sound like a broken record, but that does not surprise me.
And most Americans do not know even roughly how much is spent on Social Security or how much of the federal budget that it makes up.
Mm-hmm.
And that would include me. I've got no idea.
Well, I know that subsidies and like Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, things like that, like entitlement programs and Social Security together make 50% of the federal budget. But I think that Social Security is like 25%.
Well, if that's right, you know more than me.
I know for a fact that entitlement programs are 50% of the budget, but I don't know what the breakout is between that and, you know, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, et cetera, et cetera.
Nonetheless, few people will likely know that. And that's kind of the point, is that we just don't know how our system runs, what our budgets look like in terms of state budgets.
Adam, forget that. That's talking about specific policy issues, and you have to have a relatively high level of knowledge to know what the budget looks like and everything.
Well, hopefully not if a quarter to a half of it is going on Social Security. You should be able to at least understand that.
But, you know, for instance, TARP. You know, a lot of people don't know what TARP is. But
that's fair enough.
Just look at people who don't actually know how the system of government works. They can't accurately tell you what the executive branch, the congressional branch, and the legislative branch, and the judicial branch do and what they're comprised of. There's not a high level of knowledge about civics, I guess, in the United States. We just kind of don't understand how the government works.
And yet these are the people that, including ourselves, are walking into polling booths and making our quote-unquote informed will known. Well,
I mean, the central thrust of a democracy is that you have an educated, knowledgeable public voting. That's the goal.
Well, it's the goal. I don't think it's the assumption, though. Particularly when you go back even to Enlightenment, when the US was founded, when the French Revolution was happening, it was understood that, people who had financial investment in the country, i.e. landowners, in fact, this is what the original Constitution said.
That's correct.
Landowners were the ones that were the ones that were going to vote. So it wasn't even on the basis of knowledge, although the assumption was that these people would have also been educated to a certain degree anyway.
Right.
But it was actually the financial investment in the direction of the country was the thing that enfranchised you.
It's also why in the original Constitution, senators were not elected by popular vote. They were elected by the House of Representatives of that state.
Right.
So senators were meant to represent the statewide interests, whereas representatives were the individuals. That's evolved over time. That's been changed. And that's also why the Electoral College exists as a last-ditch protection against the uneducated public electing somebody that should not be president.
So it looks like our major problems then for voting are the low participation, but for those that even do turn out to vote, not only their cognitive biases, which automatically affect their vote, but also just the lack of knowledge, the general lack of knowledge of the participating voter. So there are, obviously when you take that at a broad brush stroke, you would say that this is a problem for democracy, because how can you have ignorant, emotional people deciding the direction of the country? It just doesn't end well. So, potential solutions. What do you think, John?
I think it's just interesting that in an age where we have near universal suffrage, where more people are allowed to vote than ever before, you have such low participation. I don't think that there's a way to 100% fix that, but I think there's two different approaches you could take. You could either implement compulsory voting like they have in Australia, where if you are able to vote, you're required to vote. Or you could strive to make the government more representative so that people would feel like their vote makes a difference. I know that for me personally, during the Democratic primary, which I normally would not vote in because generally the winner of the primary is sort of predetermined anyway. But for the Democratic primary, I voted for Bernie Sanders. And I had never enjoyed casting a vote more than I had in my life because I actually agreed with him ideologically on a lot of things. So if you feel like the person that you're voting for is representative of you, and if you feel like that person is going to implement policies that you want, you're going to be passionate enough to go out and vote. That's actually happening right now. I think in West Virginia, there's a guy named. It's actually kind of a crazy story. This guy is a state Senate candidate in West Virginia. And he voted for Trump in 2016, but it's strange. He's a liberal though, and he talks about campaign finance reform and union reform, and he actually led a lot of the West Virginia teacher union strikes in West Virginia. His name is Richard Ojeda, and he 2 days before the election, the primary election, he was beat up at a cookout. He got attacked physically, and then he ended up winning. And he ended up winning by more votes than every other candidate combined. And that's because he, if you watch interviews with him, he is committed to not taking corporate money. He's committed to not taking private interest money. And he's committed to basically representing the little guy and the people in his state. And there's a massive amount of passion behind this guy, and people are coming out to vote for him. So I think that if we could get candidates that actually represent people and people feel better represented, you're going to have more turnout, I think. So that's one way that you could do it. You could improve the system of representation. Or you could go the other route and say basically it's not just a right, it's a duty, and you're expected to take part of that duty as part of being a citizen. Which I don't think would play very well in the United States. Generally, when you tell an American that they have to do something, they're going to tell you no.
Well, that's the thing, because I think compulsory voting is worth a shot. I think it's worth trying. And I understand the American context very well. The idea that, the state telling you to do anything is kind of shock and horror, is we're compelled to do something. But the state compels you to do a lot of different things. It compels you to pay taxes. It compels you to send your kids to school. It compels you to,
Some states it compels you to buy health insurance and things like that, and that does not go over well.
No, of course not. But you could argue that there is a duty to your state. You are a citizen of the state, and by state I mean country here, not just one of the states of the United States. Therefore, you must participate. So, like I said, taxes, for instance, we have a civic duty to pay our taxes. it's illegal not to pay our taxes. The state can require this of us. Why can't it require our vote as a civic duty? You say it is for the good of this country that you vote, therefore we're requiring it. And there are other countries as well. Like you can go, well far down the lines, like Israel and Finland, for instance, that have mandatory conscription in the military. So you could easily argue that these are, particularly voting, is a worthwhile thing to do. It's not military conscription.
I agree.
So it's not like you're not being asked to lay down your life.
Yeah.
It's not even taxes. You're not even being asked to give up a portion of your income. You're just simply being asked to go and give your opinion.
No, and I agree with that. I'm more of a communitarian, I guess, than most. And I believe in the fact that while there is merit to certain types of individualism, there needs to be responsibility taken by the individual to what they owe or what they need to contribute to the community, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And so I think voting is definitely among those things that you ought to be part of the provision for. That's one of the reasons why I'm for things like universal healthcare and such, is that there is a level of, although you are an individual with your own rights, there is a level that you should be expected to contribute to the larger society as a whole. So voting, I think, is a big one. But at the same time, my fear is that it's almost like be careful what you wish for because you just might get it. Do we really want everybody voting?
Well, that's a really good question, because then you've got your numpties and nutters coming out of the woodwork to vote for whoever they want, especially if you look back to our representation episodes in part 1. If you were to add compulsory voting to proportional representation, then who on earth are you going to, what parties are you going to have represented there at that point? It's it can be quite a scary prospect, but there is at least one, although there are other countries that runs a very successful and, I think if I remember right, relatively popular compulsory voting system. And you mentioned it already, Australia. Australia is a free democratic country, but what it demands of its citizens, what the citizens technically demand of each other, because it is a democracy, is that they, every 4 or 5 years, show up to vote in the federal election. So what you've got in Australia is a group of citizens who have agreed that it is their duty to each other to participate in federal elections. So that not only do you get a government that is actually representative of not 55% of the electorate, like as was the case in the last presidential election in the US, but 91 to 95% of the electorate. Right? So you're talking about representation that is legitimate. It's legitimate representation within the bounds of the system, but they actually have a relatively proportional system as well, with certain protections to avoid your nutcase kind of parties getting into the system as well.
Yeah, but wasn't Australia in that top 10 of countries that feel like their government rarely or never represents them?
It was number 10, and I think it was about 67% or so of people.
I mean, so maybe it fixes the low participation problem, but it might not fix the general sense of representation. It needs to be incorporated with other measures to fix that.
And we did chat last time about the idea that perhaps in very well developed democratic countries that there is a high expectation on what your democratically elected government can do in terms of representation.
Right.
So perhaps you're seeing that effect in terms of Australia. But even if you weren't, yeah, you're right. There's this kind of odd sense of, even though 91 to 95% of your folk are showing up to vote, 67% of them are still saying that it's a government that doesn't actually represent their interests.
Yeah. I would guess that the average person probably looks at a government and judges its representativeness by not responsiveness as in reactivity, but I guess the concept in political science of a responsive government, which essentially is responding to the mandates of the people and providing what the people want.
Sure.
So if you have a high level of expectation for the responsiveness of your government, and you only get half of what you actually want because you live in a representative democracy, then you might not feel well represented. You might end up having a system in which everybody's voice is heard, but nobody's 100% happy.
Which is the perfect political system anyway, because particularly in Australia as well, you could also, in fact, it is the case that Australia is a two-party system, On the one hand, you've got a duo of parties, the Liberals and the Nationals, who represent a group called the Coalition. And then you've got Labour on the other side. So it very much also functions as a two-party system. So you could say that whoever's in government, at least half the population are dissatisfied with the representation that they get from their government.
So do you sacrifice some of the representativeness of a government for the participation of the people? Or is there a way to combine the two?
Well, so Australia does combine the two in a sense, because not only do you have compulsory voting, but then they run a system called instant runoff voting, which means that you rank your candidates in order, and if your first choice doesn't make it, then your vote goes to your second choice. And what this tends...
That was something I was going to bring up later is the implementing ranked choice voting.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but so what that does is that it eliminates small parties. So in the Australian sense, you do end up with these two large parties, but they're two large parties that play for the middle. Because generally in Australian politics, the majority of people, if you can imagine a bell curve, most people kind of are in the centre. Most Australians are relatively well-to-do. They'll disagree over kind of redistribution type things, like how many migrants should come in, the regular stuff that the West is dealing with just now.
Right.
But generally, most Australians will be centrist moderates. And so what that does is it actually forces both of your main parties to play for the centre. So compulsory voting moderates the type of government that you're going to get. So you would never get a Trump-type candidate in Australia.
Yeah.
You would never get you'd also never get a Bernie Sanders type figure in Australia either, like anyone that represents the extremes. But it also means that like I said, your nutter wing parties that just aren't going to get much representation either. There are the Greens, there are a few smaller parties that get one or two seats, but generally they are some version of the centre left or centre right.
Personally, I don't want a centrist government in the United States. I would prefer something more left leaning. But if you're playing to the middle, you're only going to ever be in the middle of the two extremes that are allowed in the country, So like you said, the fringe is going to be excluded, but also I think that's a problem.
One, kind of to deal with the problem of the Overton window, is the Overton window is never stable. It will shift. And so public opinion will shift over time. The question is, does it shift to the right or the left? The second thing is that in terms of the extreme parties, one, do you ever really want a revolutionary party? Like, do you want someone like a party like the Communists on one side, and to take the other extreme, the Nazis or the fascists on the other?
So then, would you just be more comfortable with parties that play towards the middle? Then
I think generally it's a safer option, and then let public opinion shift over time. So the Overton window will just naturally shift. That's my own. That would be my own preference. So the fact that America is currently, kind of like more right shifted, there is certain things on the right in American politics that I would agree with. So I would be sad to lose them if it did begin to shift out to the left. At the same time, I don't think the United States would work well under a Bernie Sanders type system. So I don't think I would necessarily want the system to run far to the left, or at least that far to the left right away. Like, it almost needs to develop naturally over time. And that's how it happened in Europe. Like, the left in Europe developed over a couple hundred years.
Yeah.
The Labour movement itself took, in the UK, I think about 50 years before it was in government. I don't think these are necessarily the outcropping of compulsory voting. I don't think compulsory or non-compulsory voting would actually have much of an effect on these things anyway. I think that's just natural progression of societal change.
Okay.
What I'd be more concerned about in terms of compulsory voting is, one, the legitimacy of the government they've represented. We've kind of already covered that. But two, who the people are that are being compelled to vote, what their biases are, and whether compulsory voting actually takes care of the biases and the lack of knowledge that the average voter has. That's the biggest argument against compulsory voting. Because, when you get 91, 92, 95% of your population, you're including everyone that has a cognitive bias.
Right.
And so what's the outcome of that?
Everyone has a cognitive bias. It's just some have them that are more extreme, obviously. But
well, so the question is actually, and this was an argument also made by Brennan in his book Against Democracy, is that he categorizes voters into three categories: hobbits,
Oh yeah, hobbits, hooligans, and Vulcans.
That's right. Hobbits,
Yeah,
hooligans, and
right,
Vulcans.
right.
Hobbits are apathetic. They don't have a political opinion, and they tend to be most people in any Western voting democratic country. Hooligans then are no, well, these guys are fans. They're like sports fans. They're nuts. They have very well formed worldviews, but they perceive everything and kind of receive their information through their biases. So these guys are the tribal political voters. They're the ones that take joy in seeing their team win. And this would be most of, again, he's writing in an American context, so he would say that these are most of America's voters. America's voters tend to be hooligans. Non-voters tend to be hobbits. Voters tend to be hooligans. And then at the very end of the scale, you've got the Vulcans, who are the rational, logical, scientifically minded people that can not only put in truthful terms their own position, but also put in truthful terms the position of their opposition without resorting to calling them stupid, evil, selfish, any one of the above negative categorizations, which would be reserved to the preserved hooligans.
Which is essentially the elite.
Effectively, yeah.
Which is the problem.
Yes, though I mean that's the problem with Brennan's whole thesis, is the idea that he effectively creates an elitist agenda for an elitist state. So I'm not arguing for Brennan, but these are his observations that I would say are truthful, actually, is that we could quite easily be categorized into these three categories. Of course, I like to consider myself a Vulcan. But is that my own bias?
I mean, probably.
Like, am I not just a hooligan after my own political biases?
I mean, I'd like to think that I'm not either, but I mean, I recognize my own biases. Like, for instance, whenever the Trump administration puts forth the policy, my immediate reaction is to say, "Oh, that's not going to work. It's not good." My immediate reaction is almost to say, "Oh, it's not even worth my consideration."
But your Vulcan-like tendency is to recognize that this could be my bias, and that makes, for voters that can do that makes them more Vulcan-like, and we should be progressing towards that.
Okay, and I agree. I think that's how people should vote. I was never 100% in support of Obama. I thought that he did plenty of misguided policies, but I like to think that I do recognize the bias, and I try to work against it.
Mm.
You know, I try to give the policies that Trump puts forward, or anybody I disagree with puts forward, an honest reading.
Sure.
I try to be intellectually honest about it as much as I can.
Right. Whereas a hooligan wouldn't accept the possibility that there was a perception of a Trump agenda, for instance, that could be in any way truthful or useful or meaningful.
And I find that to be probably the vast majority.
Right, exactly. And that's Brennan's point as well, is that most politically active people are hooligans, and only a very small minority would be Vulcans.
I mean, I agree with Brennan in his analysis, but I don't know if I can agree with him in his solutions. Because essentially, he says that we should not necessarily abandon democracy, but reform it into something different, a mutated version of democracy. In effect, every different democracy in the world is a mutated form of democracy. It's like Plato's theory of the forms, where you have the form of democracy and you have various iterations of it. So you'd have what Brennan would call an epistocracy, which is quite literally, it means ruled by, I think, the knowledgeable or the intelligent.
Yeah, right.
You would implement a sort of political knowledge test across the board, and you would have to pass that test in order to gain the right to vote. And then also, if people scored higher on those tests, Brennan literally argues that they should maybe even have more votes than somebody who scores lower on the test. So you could grade on a curve almost.
Mm-hmm. There's a few iterations of that he lays out in his book. But yeah, you're right. Effectively, it's the rule of the knowledgeable, which shouldn't be interpreted as the rule of the educated or the rule of the academic. What he argues for is having a completely open and democratic system by which the individual has to prove their political competency. So it doesn't matter whether you're a car mechanic, a plumber, an academic, or a teacher. You would have to just prove your political competency to understand problems, to understand what realistic solutions there are to such problems. You're right. It does seem to go about this in a few different ways. One of my favorites is an epistocratic veto. Effectively, it's a body of individuals who, having been shown or proven to be competent, and this is open to everyone, it's not just your elites, but having been shown to be competent, you sit on this panel and can veto any legislation passed by the Democratic body.
Oh man, that's
it's very close though to the Electoral College.
It is close to the Electoral College, but I would argue that the Electoral College has outlived its purpose. Essentially,
Well,
because it's never voted against the person who has gotten the most electoral seats. You know what I'm saying?
even in
So,
early
like,
history.
I believe so. Don't quote me on that, but from what I can tell,
And wouldn't we have benefited from that in the last election?
right? But that's what I'm saying is that it didn't do that.
Sure.
While there's no law against somebody switching their vote on the Electoral College, a lot of states expect you to, and if you don't, you're going to be pulled off of the Electoral College. So some have switched their votes in the past, but it's never affected the outcome of the election. It's never switched the outcome of the election. So you might have a few people who do that just out of personal reservations about the candidate or whatever, but for the vast majority, if a person wins 50+1 in that state, then they win the entirety of the Electoral College. There are some states that give them out proportionally. I think Nebraska and Maine do that.
Yep, I think you're right.
They give
Maybe
them out.
Washington as well.
I think so. There's
Could
a
be
third
wrong.
state, but I can't remember which one of those was. But I know Nebraska and Maine do. They do it proportionally, and then there's an additional 2 that go to the person who won the majority of the state vote or something like that. Something along those lines. But the vast majority, it's you win 50+1 and you get all of the electoral seats. So it doesn't serve the purpose of regulating what the people vote, because most of the time it goes that way. And sometimes it even counterintuitively puts the person into power that did not win the popular vote, which happened for both Bush and Trump.
Yeah, that's more of an outcome of federalism than it being an intermediary body. It's the fact that it represents the states more than it represents the individuals.
The United States was never strictly meant to be a democracy anyway. It was meant to be a republic.
Not a direct democracy.
Not a
that's
direct
right, yeah.
democracy, which essentially it would be if we abolish the Electoral College. But I guess what I'm saying is that the Electoral College doesn't have enough of an effect, I guess, on like the general outcomes of the
But
election.
imagine if it was filled with a group of people that knew what they were doing and could have veto over any legislation that came out of Congress. Because then you're talking about a completely different type of body as well.
Yeah, I think that there's just not enough trust of the elite. Especially, well, I'm speaking out of the American context. There's definitely not.
But these aren't the elite. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not strictly the elite. It's just people that have proven themselves to be competent.
Who sets the standard of competency?
That is a good question.
Let me give you a situation. Nobody can agree on facts anymore. So if you're somebody who takes the general line of scientists and scientific fact and all of that, then you might think, oh, hey, this person who believes in climate change and all of these other science-based solutions to our problems, they're competent. Somebody who doesn't take that line and doesn't believe in climate change and believes that that's all a hoax and it's not factually accurate is going to have a completely different idea of who's competent. So you're going to run into the same problem unless you're just completely ignoring those people and saying, no, you're wrong. You're factually inaccurate. So we're not going to represent you. And is that permissible?
I mean, there's no representation anyway. I think within Brennan's concept of the epistocratic veto is that there's a group of people who are chosen irrespective of their political leanings or even their ability to determine what is scientifically true or not. It's just a simple, I say simple, but it's an ability to prove competence. It doesn't actually define competence very well, I must admit.
But again, that's a problem because even something that you or I or liberals or conservatives might view as just not controversial fact can be made political, especially nowadays. So you could view, and it is viewed now by a vast majority of the population, just to say that you agree with climate science and that we should regulate based off of scientific fact is a political statement, which
Right.
to you and I is ridiculous. But that's you're never going to get an agreement on what constitutes impartiality and competence, I guess, in that case. That's the only issue.
And that's fair enough, but what Brennan, I think, bases his argument on to begin with is kind of a few tenets, is that there's a tenet of truth. So something has to be true. There is truth, like something must be true. Second point being is that there are differences in the ability of some people to determine that truth relative to others. So in other words, there will be better people to determine what truth is. Third, he argues that people can disqualify themselves from competence. In other words, given that some people will likely be able to determine what truth is, some people will prove themselves to be incapable of doing so. And that could be your hooligans, for instance, like people who are just knowingly and unapologetically biased. Right? So I think it's like literally that simple. Then anyone who gets past those three has the capacity to be able to serve on something like an epistocratic veto committee.
So you would just scrap the whole idea of a generalized election?
Well, no, he wouldn't. For instance, that's not within his... He would have the democratic body, but the epistocratic body has the ability to veto anything coming out of the democratic body. So imagine a third chamber of Congress, but one made up completely of epistocrats.
I think the original idea was that the people that are elected to represent us should be epistocrats.
I mean, that's as old as Plato. That's as old as Plato, because then you've got I think it's the class of guardians, something like that, the guardian class.
Well, the philosopher kings.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the philosopher kings. That's sort of what the epistocratic veto would be. But
so Brennan kind of modernizes the concept.
He modernizes his concept, but eventually that body will become corrupt, just like the supposedly representative House of Representatives and Senate have.
Right, but the hope is that the epistocratic body would be able to recognize its own corruption before it fully takes hold.
I mean, I think that's kind of optimistic.
Of course, no. My skepticism of this is as deep as any other kind of political body, because ultimately when you deal with human beings, you're going to have an imperfect system which will more than likely devolve into corruption at some point.
One last thing that I'd like to cover before we wrap up is something that Brennan covers briefly called the enfranchisement lottery. Do you know about this?
Not too well.
So what the enfranchisement lottery is, it's almost like the draft. And what would happen is there would be a representative sample similar to what you would do for a survey. So when they pull a representative sample from the states, this would be multiple thousands of people. But you would pull a random amount of people, sort of like you would with jury duty or the draft, and you pull them in, and they're subject to several weeks, probably like a month. It would have to be a while because of the complexities of modern government. You need a good amount of time to educate people on the issues. And you educate these people on the issues, and then that lottery of people are the ones who then vote on the issues.
Who get to make the decision.
Yep.
And then it's replaced each time for each issue.
Each time. So just like a jury, you replace it each time. And then so each citizen would be sort of expected to serve whenever they come up for the enfranchisement lottery. And then you obviously need to be educated on the issues. And then after having that education, presumably pass some sort of a political competency test and then vote.
See, that's interesting as well. I like that idea. It undoes everything representative about the system.
Exactly. It undoes everything representative of the system. And reading the arguments made by Brennan, I had contraction in my mind immediately from the American context of valuing everybody's vote, and it's a democracy, and we need to be representative of the people. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and we already limit the amount of people who are allowed to vote, and we limit it based on their competency. So you can only vote if you're over 18. We don't trust children to have the same competency as adults in these political matters. But suddenly, once you pass the threshold of turning 18, some arbitrary date that doesn't really have any bearing on how much you know. I mean, I've met 16-year-olds who know more about politics than some 40, 50-year-olds I've met. Age doesn't really matter. But we accept that under 18 you shouldn't be allowed to vote. We don't allow legal, I'm not talking about illegal immigrants, I'm talking about legalized immigrants, and you were one, so you would know. We don't allow them to vote until they can pass a civics test. And you know something? As a United States citizen, I did fairly well on the civics test for immigrants, but I didn't get everything right. So we expect legal immigrants to come into this nation to have a higher level of civic knowledge than most Americans to be able to have the franchise, yet we just give it to people just because they're born here. I started thinking about it in those terms, and it's like, yeah, we do accept limitations on it. You know, we accept limitations on our right to vote and the right of people living in the country to vote, in the case of legal immigrants. Is something like this feasible? But I think what happens is if you do accept any of these alternatives, you are fundamentally changing the way democracy works. You're fundamentally switching forms of government, essentially.
Right. You'd be taking a post-democratic step. And I'm using that terminology intentionally. It's almost beyond democracy. It's the next step beyond it. It's not a step backwards, because, and again, this is an argument from Brennan, is that, you know, he would argue that democracy is instrumental. In other words, you know, does it bring about the most just and most efficient and the best form of life for its citizens? Up to now, yes, it has. It is the best form of government. Democracies are the richest, the most well-off, the most egalitarian, the most just. Like, that is just true across the board. But if you're to view systems of government in instrumental terms, does an epistocratic system produce these things at even higher and even better and even more efficient quantities? In which case, then, Brennan would argue that you need to take that step beyond democracy and say, yes, we want more justice, more efficiency, more, or even better representation of, what we should be achieving or striving for. Because otherwise, at the moment, you've just got a bunch of kind of randomized meatbags deciding what direction your country is going in.
The alternative that I would most likely support would be something like the enfranchisement lottery, because that seems most fair, and it also doesn't single out people and make it you feel like there's a separate class of citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, there would be really a separate class of citizens if you're talking about like epistocratic veto. You know, you're saying, well, these people are the intelligent ones who know what's going on so they can vote. With something like the enfranchisement lottery, if you ever got to a point where you had decided to abandon democracy altogether and move towards this system, that at least takes a randomized sample of the people. It changes every year, and theoretically, everybody has a chance to have their voice heard. And I could see that being incredibly controversial in the state, obviously, because who then is doing the educating? Who's writing the curriculum essentially for that?
Right. That was my thought reading through Brennan's ideas, that you could just so easily see the manipulation that could happen in the system to result in specific outcomes. And so you could easily have people of power still pulling the strings.
Yeah. So I think, honestly, as flawed as it is, democracy is going to have to hold, because
agreed.
To move towards an epistocratic system, number one, you have the issue of how the heck do you determine competency? And number two, even if you step outside of that and say, okay, we're not going to determine competency, we're going to have these enfranchisement lotteries. Who is going to determine what the curriculum for those enfranchisement lotteries is going to be? Because you've already established you can't trust the general public to set up this education system. You are then entrusting the government to create a curriculum for the people to vote on what the government should do. I think that definitely has a heightened danger of authoritarianism and dictatorship. And
so if it's not an epistocratic system, would you even try compulsory voting to finish out?
So essentially that's what I was going to say. Is I was going to say you could try a system like compulsory voting coupled with a more representative form of government, like a modified version of proportional representation, which sort of protects against these fringe parties from taking control.
And it's also the case in compulsory voting, and this is more anecdote than actual research, but in chatting to some of my Australian friends, they very much like the compulsory system. They find that for every idiot that turns out to vote for the monster raving loony party, you've got 2 or 3 folk that are turning out to vote for legitimate, political parties with legitimate answers to legitimate problems. So in chatting with a couple of them, the ones I have spoken to have said that they feel almost a sense of duty to actually inform themselves if they have to vote. And so if they have to vote, then I'd better know what I'm voting for.
Yeah.
And I think that would generally be in a relatively well-off educated society like Australia, and maybe that's the failure of the compulsory voting system, but like Australia, that the average Australian will feel kind of a sense of duty and be able to carry out said duty with a sense of reasonable seriousness. But Australia is well off. It is stable. It's still predominantly white. There aren't too many racial cleavages yet, although that is changing.
Yeah.
And so is it because there is a specific context like Australia that compulsory voting actually works?
Yeah, I do wonder how well it would work in a ethnically and culturally diverse and pluralistic place like the United States.
Yeah, it's a good question. Although in terms of pluralism, I would say that Australia is quite pluralistic in terms, again, particularly in terms of religion. There's quite a variety of religions represented. In fact, I believe it's a third of Australians weren't actually born in Australia.
Wow.
Yeah,
wow, that
it's something massive.
high.
It's a massive migrant population.
Wow.
It's something ridiculous like that. So.
In conclusion, I would say that in addition to last week where we talked about more representative forms of government, where I would favor a proportional representation system closer to something like you see in Scotland or the Netherlands, coupling that somehow in a way that works with compulsory voting, or creating a system in which it is representative enough that it motivates participation. Essentially, I'm running off the assumption that if you build it, they will come. If you build a representative form of government, people will come to be represented. And I think that's what should be strived for, because moving past democracy, I don't think is a viable solution. I think it's the best solution that we found so far. For better or for worse, I think that's where the future of representative government lies.
I personally am a big fan of the compulsory voting system. I want to see it tried somewhere, anywhere, really, other than Australia, because it's other than limited to Australia. And I think Peru and maybe Argentina, there just aren't many good examples of it. So I would like to see it tried out, and maybe then it would actually provide a reason for people to get actively and politically involved in, their lives, their political lives, because I think people underestimate, the amount to which their, the political institutions actually affect their lives. But I mean, to do so in almost any country would require a massive, constitutional change. And speaking of constitutions, the next section of our series will actually be looking at constitutions themselves. What problems in our democratic societies are actually caused by the constitutions that we have, and whether constitutions themselves are easily amendable. Does a country like the UK, which doesn't have a constitution, does that fare better democratically than a country like the United States or Ireland? That's what we're going to dig into next time, so we hope that you'll join us for that.
And that's all we have time for this week. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Absurdistanis. We're also on YouTube as Absurdistan with an exclamation point. Be sure to check out our website, absurdistanis.com. That's absurdistanis.com. We post all episodes to this website and also host forums for discussion so that you as the audience can engage with our content. Thank you for listening, and as always, stay informed.